The summer sun in Baltimore had a way of rising fast, pushing light and heat into every crack of the city before most people had finished their coffee. By 10 a.m., the air along Pratt Street shimmered above the asphalt, a faint mirage over the blacktop. Elijah Brooks moved with the patience of a man who had done the same routine for years, slow enough not to spill his iced coffee, steady enough to keep the metal panels of his hot dog cart from rattling too loud. The corner of Pratt and Calvert was his spot. Not officially his, not in the way a storefront could be claimed, but official enough to be written down on his vendor's permit, laminated and tucked into the back of his wallet. Every morning, he unfolded the cart's side panels, clipped the Brooks hot dog sign to the front, and wiped down the steel until it caught the morning light. He'd watch the street wake up, the first city buses hissing to a stop, delivery trucks unloading boxes for the corner deli, the scent of fresh pretzels drifting from the bakery 2 doors down. Regulars always came early. A pair of office clerks from the insurance building across the street waved as they crossed. Elijah raised his chin in reply, the closest thing to a good morning for a man who preferred to save his words for real conversations. A teenager in a red hoodie lingered near the bus shelter, sipping from a paper cup like he had nowhere urgent to be. Elijah had noticed him before, a few times a week for the last month. Kid kept to himself, earbuds in, eyes moving like he was watching everything, without wanting to be seen doing it. Elijah had been that age once, quiet, restless, trying to figure out where you fit in a city that seemed to have already decided your place. The rhythm of the corner was its own kind of music. Tires over manhole covers, distant gulls from the harbor, the low hum of voices outside the Starbucks a few yards away. Elijah kept the grill going at an even sizzle, flipping dogs with the same easy motion he'd used for 20 years. A shadow fell over the counter. "Elijah," said Mrs. Eleanor Price, her voice warm, even in the summer heat. She was a retired librarian with a habit of stopping by once or twice a week for a hot dog and a chat about whatever novel she had just finished. Today she wore a sun hat and carried a tote bag full of hardcovers. "Morning, Mrs. Price," Elijah said, sliding a bun into the warmer. "You reading your way through the library again?" She smiled. "Trying to. But the sun's too nice to stay indoors. Thought I'd grab lunch before the rush." "Si, bon está. Ah, si." They spoke easily, the kind of neighborly conversation that didn't need much content, just the comfort of being known. She left with her order and a promise to bring him the mystery novel she'd just finished. Elijah turned back to the grill, adjusting the flame. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the kid in the red hoodie shift his stance, glancing toward something behind Elijah's cart. The change in the air came a second later, a heaviness, like clouds rolling in on a clear day. The sound of a car door shutting broke through the hum of the street. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, final. Elijah didn't turn immediately. Years of service in the Navy had taught him that you didn't always face trouble head-on until you knew which way it was coming from. Boots on pavement, heavy, deliberate steps. He could almost measure the distance by the rhythm. When Sergeant Cole Maddox came into view, his uniform seemed to absorb the sunlight rather than reflect it. Dark sunglasses hid his eyes, but the set of his jaw and the tilt of his shoulders spoke plenty. His right hand rested casually near the baton on his belt, a casualness Elijah had learned meant the opposite. "Elijah Brooks," Maddox said, his voice low but edged. "We need to talk about your little setup here." The words were almost conversational, but there was no conversation in them. The teenager in the hoodie took a half step forward, his phone in his hand now. Mrs. Price, a few yards away, stopped walking. Elijah straightened, wiping his hands on the towel tucked into his waistband. "Morning, Sergeant," he said evenly. "Something wrong with my setup?" Maddox smiled without humor. "Depends who you ask." The light at Pratt and Calvert turned green, and a wave of pedestrians crossed between them, unaware they were stepping through the start of something that would echo far beyond this street. Some confrontations start with a shout. This one began with a smile that didn't reach the eyes. Sergeant Cole Maddox stopped a step short of the cart, the sun glinting off his sunglasses. His voice was even, but the weight behind it pressed into the space between them. "You've been here a lot lately," he said. "More than the city code allows." Elijah Brooks kept his hands busy, sliding a hot dog onto a bun. "I've been here the same days, same hours for years," he replied. "Every one of them with a permit in my wallet." From the bus shelter, Marcus Hill tilted his phone just slightly, the lens aimed in their direction. He wasn't the only one. The barista from the coffee shop had stepped outside, holding her phone down by her thigh, recording without looking like it. Maddox's smile thinned. "That piece of paper doesn't change the fact you're blocking pedestrian space." Elijah nodded once toward the faded yellow tape lines painted on the concrete. 10 feet clearance. City inspector measured it himself. You can check it." "Shia. I don't need to check it," Maddox said, his tone sharpened. "What I see is loitering. You're playing businessman on public property." A few heads turned in the crowd, the remark loud enough to carry. Mrs. Eleanor Price froze mid-step, a brown paper bag in her hand, eyes narrowing. Elijah laid the tongs down carefully, keeping his movement slow. "I'm not playing anything," he said. "I'm working, same as you." Maddox stepped closer, the heel of his boot scraping the pavement. The distance between them shrank until Elijah could see his own reflection in the mirrored lenses. "You're going to pack this up," Maddox said, his voice low. "Right now." Elijah met his gaze, or at least where his gaze should have been behind the glass. "Not without a written citation. That's the law, Sergeant. You know it." The space around them tightened. A delivery truck idled at the corner, engine rumbling, but the street itself seemed to go still. Maddox's right hand slid off the baton, but only to grab the front of Elijah's shirt. The move was sudden, a jerk that slammed Elijah back into his own cart. The grill rattled, the smell of onions sharp in the air. "Hey!" someone shouted from the sidewalk. Maddox didn't look up. His arm came around Elijah's neck in a hard, practiced chokehold. It wasn't for control. It was for dominance. Elijah's hands went up, not to fight, but to find air. The world narrowed to the pressure crushing his windpipe and the pounding in his ears. From somewhere in the haze, he heard Mrs. Price's voice, tight with outrage. "Let him go! He's done nothing wrong!" Marcus's voice was quieter, meant for the phone's mic. "He's choking him. I got it on video." Elijah's vision blurred, edges darkening. The sounds of the street faded, replaced by the low roar of his own heartbeat. Somewhere deep, past the panic, something shifted. A memory of Navy drills, the way you used your opponent's weight, the way you turned a hold into an opening, his feet planted, his shoulder twisted. Some confrontations start with a shout. This one began with a smile that didn't reach the eyes. Sergeant Cole Maddox stopped a step short of the cart, the sun glinting off his sunglasses. His voice was even, but the weight behind it pressed into the space between them. "You've been here a lot lately," he said. "More than the city code allows." Elijah Brooks kept his hands busy, sliding a hot dog onto a bun. "I've been here the same days, same hours for years," he replied. "Every one of them with a permit in my wallet." From the bus shelter, Marcus Hill tilted his phone just slightly, the lens aimed in their direction. He wasn't the only one. The barista from the coffee shop had stepped outside, holding her phone down by her thigh, recording without looking like it. Maddox's smile thinned. "That piece of paper doesn't change the fact you're blocking pedestrian space." Elijah nodded once toward the faded yellow tape lines painted on the concrete. 10 feet clearance. City inspector measured it himself. You can check it." "I don't need to check it," Maddox said. His tone sharpened. "What I see is loitering. You're playing businessman on public property." A few heads turned in the crowd, the remark loud enough to carry. Mrs. Eleanor Price froze mid-step, a brown paper bag in her hand, eyes narrowing. Elijah laid the tongs down carefully, keeping his movements slow. "I'm not playing anything," he said. "I'm working, same as you." Maddox stepped closer. the heel of his boot scraping the pavement. The distance between them shrank until Elijah could see his own reflection in the mirrored lenses. "You're going to pack this up," Maddox said, his voice low. "Right now." Elijah met his gaze, or at least where his gaze should have been behind the glass. "Not without a written citation. That's the law, Sergeant. You know it." The space around them tightened. A delivery truck idled at the corner, engine rumbling, but the street itself seemed to go still. A woman in scrubs paused with her coffee halfway to her lips. The barista leaned against the doorframe, watching. Maddox's right hand slid off the baton, but only to grab the front of Elijah's shirt. The move was sudden, a jerk that slammed Elijah back into his own cart. The grill rattled, the smell of onions sharp in the air. "Hey!" someone shouted from the sidewalk. Maddox didn't look up. His arm came around Elijah's neck in a hard, practiced chokehold. It wasn't for control. It was for dominance. Elijah's hands went up, not to fight, but to find air. The world narrowed to the pressure crushing his windpipe and the pounding in his ears. The metal edge of the cart dug into his back. His left shoulder throbbed where it hit the corner. From somewhere in the haze, he heard Mrs. Price's voice, tight with outrage. "Let him go! He's done nothing wrong!" Marcus's voice was quieter, meant for the phone's mic. "He's choking him. I got it on video." Elijah's vision blurred, edges darkening. The sounds of the street faded, replaced by the low roar of his own heartbeat. He caught flashes, steam rising off the grill, Maddox's forearm tightening, the glare of sunlight on the steel pole a few feet away. The crowd began to shift, murmurs growing louder. Someone else had pulled out a phone. A man in a suit stepped forward, then hesitated, hands half raised as if unsure whether to get involved. Maddox's breath was hot against Elijah's ear. "You think you run this corner?" he muttered, low enough for only Elijah to hear. "I run it. You're done here." Elijah's pulse pounded. The chokehold wasn't just cutting off air. It was cutting off the thin line between standing and collapsing. Somewhere deep, past the panic, something shifted. A memory of Navy drills, the way you used your opponent's weight, the way you turned a hold into an opening. He could almost hear his old training officer's voice. "Don't fight the arm. Move the body." His feet planted, his shoulder twisted. When survival takes over, your body remembers, moves your mind forgot. Elijah shifted his weight, pivoting his hips the way he'd done in a dozen training drills decades ago. Maddox wasn't expecting resistance, real resistance, from a man his age. The sudden twist broke the chokehold just enough for Elijah to pull in a thin ribbon of air. With that breath came focus. He drove his elbow back into Maddox's chest, not to injure, but to force space. Maddox stumbled a half step, surprised, his grip loosening. Elijah used that momentum, turning hard to his left. The two men moved as one for a split second, a locked struggle, before Maddox's head met the steel pole with a sharp, clean crack. Time fractured. The sound was loud enough for everyone on the corner to hear, but it was the silence after that made people stop moving. Maddox's body went limp, crumpling to the sidewalk like wet laundry. Blood began to darken his hairline, then run along the pale curve of his temple. Elijah stood there, chest heaving, the heat from the grill still clinging to his skin. His hands lifted halfway, palms out, not in surrender, but in instinct, as if telling the world he meant no more harm. Marcus's phone was still up, the red recording light unwavering. "Got it," he whispered, not to anyone in particular, Mrs. Price's paper bag had torn open, an apple rolling out onto the sidewalk. She didn't pick it up. Her eyes were fixed on the scene, wide and unblinking. No one rushed to help Maddox. Not yet. A man in khakis bent low, checked for breathing, then looked up and shook his head, his expression unreadable. Elijah didn't move toward the fallen officer. He took one slow step back, then another, the edge of his heel brushing the curb. Above them, the traffic light cycled from green to yellow to red, casting a shifting glow over the motionless figure on the ground. From somewhere down Pratt Street, the faint wail of sirens began to rise. Elijah felt it in his ribs before he heard it clearly. A vibration, more than a sound. The crowd was no longer silent. Voices layered over each other. "He just dropped him." "That cop had him in a chokehold first. Somebody call an ambulance." "It's already called." Elijah's vision had cleared, but the adrenaline left his limbs heavy. He looked at the steel pole, the dent where Maddox's skull had struck, and thought briefly, absurdly, about how many times he'd leaned against that pole on slow afternoons, never knowing it would become the center of something much bigger. Marcus lowered his phone for the first time, glancing at Elijah. There was no smile, no nod, just a look that said, "I saw the whole thing." The sirens grew louder, flashing blue and red against the windows of nearby shops. Elijah didn't run. Every instinct told him to stay still. He thought of Danielle, of how she'd tell him later he'd made the right call. He thought of his grandson, and how explaining this would be harder than living through it. The first cruiser screeched to a stop. 2 officers jumped out, hands already on their weapons, shouting commands. "Hands where we can see them!" Elijah's palms were already up. The commands came fast, overlapping, each one sharper than the last. "Step away from the cart! Down on your knees!" Elijah didn't argue. He lowered himself slowly, the pavement's heat pressing through the fabric of his pants. A bead of sweat traced down his temple, part from the sun, part from the weight of a dozen eyes fixed on him. "Officer down!" one of the arriving cops shouted into his radio. Another knelt beside Maddox, pressing a cloth to his head. The red bloomed through it almost immediately. Mrs. Price took a step forward, her voice breaking. "That man was attacked first. I saw it." "Ma'am, step back," an officer barked, holding up a hand without looking at her. From the bus shelter, Marcus had lifted his phone again. His angle shifted, catching the 2 officers as they moved toward Elijah, cuffs in hand. The lens trembled slightly, but the image was steady enough to show the look on Elijah's face. Calm, resigned, unflinching. The first cuff clicked shut around his wrist. The second followed, biting just a little too tight. "You're under arrest for assaulting a police officer," one of them said, voice flat, already moving him toward the cruiser. Elijah didn't respond. His eyes scanned the crowd. Mrs. Price, the barista, the man in khakis, Marcus. The teenager met his gaze and held it, the recording light still blinking. As they reached the open cruiser door, Elijah caught a last glimpse of the steel pole. In the late morning light, it gleamed dull silver, the dent visible even from here. He slid into the back seat, the vinyl hot against his legs, the smell of sweat and disinfectant filling the small space. Through the windshield, he could see more cruisers pulling in, blocking the intersection. Somewhere beyond the glass, the sirens quieted, replaced by the low murmur of voices and the occasional shout for crowd control. Marcus raised his phone higher, zooming in on Elijah's face as the cruiser pulled away. The image would be uploaded before the light at Pratt and Calvert turned green. Elijah leaned back against the seat, cuffs pressing into his wrists, and closed his eyes. The blue and red lights flickered against the inside of his eyelids, and he knew, before they even reached the precinct, that nothing about his life would be the same again. The ride to the precinct was short, but the silence inside the cruiser stretched it into something longer. The air conditioning blasted from dusty vents, carrying a faint smell of vinyl and old coffee. Elijah sat still, wrists pinched in the cuffs behind his back, eyes fixed on the streaked glass of the side window. Baltimore passed in fragments, red brick row houses, chain-link fences, corner stores with hand-painted signs, each one sliding by like scenes from a film he didn't remember agreeing to be in. At the first intersection, a young woman stood on the curb, holding her phone high. Elijah didn't need to guess what she was recording. The sight of her, framed against the flashing lights, would soon join a growing stream of videos, photos, and shaky eyewitness accounts racing across social media. Inside the precinct, the air was different, denser, buzzing with the layered sounds of ringing phones, radio chatter, and the heavy steps of officers moving between desks. The desk sergeant barely glanced up as Elijah was led past, his focus on a computer screen that reflected faint blue in his glasses. "Brooks, Elijah," one of the arresting officers said flatly, passing paperwork across the counter. "Assault on a police officer, Officer Maddox." The sergeant's eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly, like someone recognizing the first notes of a song they didn't want stuck in their head. "Booking room 2, he said, sliding the papers back. In the booking room, Elijah was told to stand against a wall. A camera clicked twice, capturing him from the front and side. They took his fingerprints next, the cold ink pressing into his skin, each roll of his fingers onto the card, a reminder that the system wanted to define him by marks, not by the man himself. "Shoelaces," a younger officer said, gesturing. Elijah bent stiffly, slipping them out, the cuffs still biting into his wrists. They led him down a hallway lined with cinder-block walls painted an institutional beige. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a constant, low buzz. The cell they placed him in was small, steel bench, toilet with no seat, the faint smell of bleach trying and failing to cover years of use. Elijah sat, feeling the cool metal through his pants, and exhaled slowly. It didn't take long for the first sign to reach him that the outside world was moving faster than the walls around him. An officer passed the cell, phone in hand, murmuring to a colleague, "It's already at 50,000 views." Another voice, lower, from somewhere down the hall, "That chokehold's clear as day." Footsteps approached. The man who stopped at the bars was tall, black, uniform neatly pressed, eyes steady but carrying a weight of their own. His name tag read Whitaker. "Elijah Brooks," he said quietly. "I'm Officer Andre Whitaker." Elijah studied him for a moment before answering. "We met before?" Whitaker shook his head. "No, sir, but I've seen you on Pratt Street, and I've seen the footage." He lowered his voice further. "It's clean. Shows Maddox putting you in the hold before you touched him." Elijah's jaw tightened. "Then why am I in here and he's not?" Whitaker glanced over his shoulder before answering. "Because the badge still protects some people more than others. But not all of us are blind." They held each other's gaze for a moment that said more than words could. Then Whitaker stepped back. "Your daughter's on her way. Danielle Brooks." Elijah's face softened at the name. "Yeah, she doesn't give up easy." "You'll need that," Whitaker said. "This thing's bigger than you now. Whole city's watching." Minutes later, the cell door opened again. Danielle stepped in with the kind of presence that filled a room without raising her voice. Her navy blazer was rumpled from travel, her phone in one hand, and a folder tucked under her arm. "You look like hell," she said, but there was pride under the worry in her eyes. "Feels about right," Elijah replied. She didn't hug him. Not here. Instead, she handed him a bottle of water. "I've already filed for immediate release pending review. Videos everywhere, Twitter, Facebook, the local news. Civil rights groups are circling." Elijah took a sip, the water lukewarm but welcome. "You think they'll listen?" Danielle's mouth set in a firm line. "They won't have a choice, not with this much daylight on it." Somewhere in the building a phone rang twice, then stopped. Whitaker reappeared at the door, phone in hand. He glanced at Danielle, then at Elijah, and passed the phone through the bars. On the screen was a message from an unknown number. "The video's everywhere. They can't bury this." Elijah looked at Whitaker, one eyebrow raised. "Friend of yours?" Whitaker's answer was a single nod. Outside, unseen but not unfelt, the city's attention was locking onto a single corner of Pratt and Calvert, and the story of what had happened there was no longer just his to carry. Baltimore City Circuit Court was an old building, all stone and shadow, its high windows letting in strips of morning light that cut across the wood-paneled walls. The smell of old paper and furniture polish hung in the air, blending with the faint scent of rain from the gray sky outside. Elijah Brooks sat at the defense table, shoulders straight despite the stiffness in his back. Danielle sat beside him, flipping through a folder, her movements precise, each page turned like she was setting down a card in a game she intended to win. In the gallery behind them, the air was thick with quiet anticipation. Neighbors from Pratt Street sat shoulder to shoulder with strangers who had come after seeing the video. Marcus Hill was there in his red hoodie, hood down today, phone tucked into his pocket. Mrs. Eleanor Price sat 2 rows back, hands clasped over her purse, eyes fixed forward. Across the aisle, the city prosecutor entered with a confident stride, file in hand, his gaze skimming over Elijah without stopping. He had the air of someone who'd done this 100 times, secure in the pattern, expecting the same outcome as always. The bailiff called for order, and the judge entered. She was in her 60s, silver hair pulled into a neat bun, her expression calm but watchful. Everyone rose, then sat again as she adjusted her glasses and looked over the docket. The prosecutor began. His voice was steady, the words smooth, but the story he told was thin. A street vendor refusing lawful orders, resisting arrest, causing injury to an officer. He spoke as if the footage didn't exist, as if the courtroom could be persuaded by the absence of what everyone had already seen. Danielle stood when it was her turn. She didn't move quickly. She let the silence stretch a moment before stepping into the open space between the tables. "My client," she began, "is a 62-year-old Navy veteran, a father, a grandfather, and a licensed street vendor who has worked the same corner for more than 2 decades without incident. On the day in question, he was approached by an officer with a documented history of excessive force complaints. He was placed in a chokehold, a maneuver that can kill, in broad daylight." She paused, letting her words settle. "This," she said, gesturing toward the monitor that had been wheeled into the room, "is not speculation. It's not a he said, she said. It's the city's own light pole camera." The bailiff pressed a button. The video played, grainy but clear enough. Maddox approaching, the words exchanged, the sudden lunge, the chokehold, Elijah's struggle for air, the twist, the impact with the steel pole. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the machine. When it ended, Danielle faced the judge. "What we are here to decide is not whether Mr. Brooks survived, but whether he was supposed to." The judge leaned back slightly, her eyes moving between the monitor and Elijah. The prosecutor shuffled his papers but didn't speak. Danielle continued, her tone unwavering. "He didn't run. He didn't strike in anger. He stood his ground until the law could catch up to the truth. That's what the footage shows. That's what the witnesses confirm." In the gallery, Marcus sat forward in his seat, hands clasped. Mrs. Price dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The judge cleared her throat. The court acknowledges the video as primary evidence. The court also notes the officer's conduct as concerning and potentially excessive. Given the evidence and the ongoing internal investigation, the charges against Mr. Brooks are suspended. He is released from custody pending the outcome of the review. No one clapped, but there was a shift in the air, a collective exhale, the quiet relief of tension easing after too many days wound tight. Elijah rose slowly. Danielle touched his arm just briefly before gathering her papers. As they walked out, the press outside surged forward, cameras flashing, voices calling his name. They didn't stop. Not yet. 2 months later, the air on Pratt and Calvert carried a different kind of weight. The summer heat had slipped away, replaced by the crisp edges of early autumn. The leaves along the sidewalk trees had turned the color of old copper, and the morning sun caught them just right as they drifted down in lazy spirals. Elijah Brooks arrived early, as he always had, though this morning wasn't about opening shop. His new cart sat under a tarp at the curb, delivered the day before by a pair of volunteers from the community center. The old one was gone, sold for parts, its dents and scratches now someone else's history, but the space it had occupied still felt like his. He paused at the corner, paper cup of coffee warming his hands. Across the street, the steel pole still stood, dent and all. Fresh paint covered the rust and the blood, but nothing could hide the small indentation at head height, a truth too stubborn to sand away. Above it, a mural stretched upward, the silhouette of a man standing tall, palm open in quiet defiance, colors radiating behind him. At the bottom, in clean black letters, "Here we stand." Marcus Hill was there, leaning against the bus shelter with the same red hoodie, though the hood was down today. He wasn't filming, just watching. When Elijah's eyes met his, the boy gave a small nod. Acknowledgement, not ceremony. Danielle arrived a few minutes later, dressed down in jeans and a loose blue blazer, clipboard under one arm. "You ready?" she asked, smiling faintly. "I've been ready longer than they know," Elijah said. Together they crossed to the tarp-covered cart. Danielle pulled the cover away to reveal polished steel and clean navy trim, Elijah's name stenciled on the side in block letters, "Brooks's Justice Dogs." The lettering didn't shout, but it didn't whisper either. Neighbors gathered as Elijah began his setup. He worked with slow precision, checking the propane line, wiping each surface twice, arranging buns in neat stacks. The smell of onions hit the air as the grill hissed to life, drawing people closer. Mrs. Eleanor Price was first in line. "Thought I'd better get one before you sell out," she said. "First one's on the house," Elijah replied, handing her a hot dog wrapped in foil. As the afternoon settled in, the corner filled with chatter and the shuffle of people coming and going. Cars honked as they passed, some drivers leaning out the window to wave. A local jazz trio set up near the cafe, their soft notes weaving through the street noise. Near the pole, a city official stepped forward, holding a framed certificate. "On behalf of the community," she said, "we name this Brooks Corner, a place of resilience and respect." The small crowd clapped, but Elijah simply nodded, the weight of the moment more than enough without words. Later, when the grill cooled and the crowd thinned, Elijah sat on the bench facing the pole. Danielle joined him, her coat draped over one arm. "You know," she said, "I fought a lot of cases, but this one, it didn't end in the courtroom. It ended here." "That's because justice doesn't live in buildings," Elijah said, eyes on the mural. "It lives in people. And sometimes you've got to feed it slow, like a meal it's forgotten how to eat." They sat quietly, watching as Marcus crossed the street, stopping to look up at the mural before heading toward the harbor. A little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve, pointing to the cart. The mother bent down and whispered something, and the girl smiled shyly. The city moved on around them, but the corner felt anchored now, a fixed point in a shifting map. Elijah sipped the last of his coffee, the paper cup warm against his palms. He didn't think of the chokehold, the pole, or the days in the cell. Not right now. He thought about the grill, the faces in the crowd, and the quiet truth that for the first time in a long while, he wasn't standing alone. Sometimes the end of a story feels less like a period and more like a slow exhale. In the weeks after Elijah returned to his corner, the city moved on in its noisy, restless way, but something subtle lingered. Neighbors still paused a little longer when they passed by. Strangers who had only seen him in headlines now stopped to shake his hand, and that steel pole, once just a place to lean in the shade, had become a quiet marker of change, a reminder that even an ordinary street corner could hold a piece of history. In those moments, you could see what the fight had really been about. It wasn't just about one man clearing his name, or one officer facing the consequences of his actions. It was about how the Black community and those who stood beside it could take something meant to diminish a person and turn it into a place of dignity. It was about the way people rallied, not because a leader told them to, but because their own hearts refused to look away. The Black community knows this rhythm, the long stretches of being unseen, interrupted by the rare, risky chance to demand to be seen. And when that chance came, Elijah met it with the steadiness of a man who knew who he was before anyone else tried to define him. The lesson is simple, but not easy. Hold your ground when truth is on your side. Protect your dignity as carefully as you protect your breath. Stand firm, not with rage, but with resolve, so that even when the dust settles, the space you reclaimed still belongs to you. In real life, we're not often asked to face a steel pole or a chokehold, but we are asked in smaller ways to decide whether we will let someone else's judgment shape our worth. And every time we refuse, we build something larger than ourselves. Like a lantern in a window on a dark street, one quiet act of courage can help guide others through the hardest stretches of the road. If you've lived long enough, you've seen it happen more than once. You've seen the Black community gather after a loss, after an injustice, and slowly turn pain into a gathering place, a mural, a meal shared. You've seen it in churches, in union halls, on front porches in the summer. And maybe, like Elijah, you've felt the weight of those moments, the way they ask for more than anger, the way they require patience, unity, and an unshakable belief in your own humanity. So take a moment right now to sit with what this story has offered. Think about the corners in your own life, the places where you've had to stand a little taller, speak a little clearer, breathe a little deeper to keep what's yours. And if this story has touched something in you, pass it along. Share it with someone who might need the reminder that they too have the right to stand, to breathe, and to be seen. Because in the end, that's how change takes root, not in the roar of a single moment, but in the steady human warmth we choose to carry forward.